tonight's webinar, which is going to be about rock gardening, is brought to you by a very enthusiastic rock gardener, Jan Dolzer, who can introduce himself and then tell you a little bit about what the webinar is going to be about. So anyway, Jan, all yours.
Thanks a lot, Steve, and thanks a lot, everybody, for coming. Today we're going to talk, not surprisingly, about rock gardening, and that's going to be an introduction. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Jan Dolzer. Many of you know me. I live in Santa Rosa now, moved there the middle of last year. I'm a neurobiologist and a smartass by training. Have sea kayaked since 2011 and for real since about 2015. I've initiated a lot of paddles with BAST, with the now defunct Sacramento Sea Kayakers, Western Sea Kayakers, and also back channel paddles. And currently own 3 boats. One is a Jackson Karma RG, and I'll have a slide about boats. A Dagger Stratus 14.5L and a Sterling Grand Illusion, and you'll see particularly the first 2 in some of the footage that I'm going to show today. I never graduated the skills clinic for a simple reason. My job, we make biomedical instrumentation, requires me to travel a lot, particularly in summer. That's the hot travel season for me. So I could never commit to being available all weekends, which is one of the important things for the skills clinic. I have no ACA or BCU levels, and I'm not an instructor. So the usual disclaimer, if you buy stock based on my advice or listen to anything I'm saying, you're on your own and it's your own fault. The agenda today. I'm already in the middle of the introduction. I'm going to talk about boats and gear and how to modify both of these. I will talk about paddle strokes that are useful for rock gardening. I'll ask you to give me a hand with clap. Cover do's and don'ts. So I was going to talk about timing, what's important to with timing, specifically in rock gardening. And so I was talking about risks. That's also an important thing. Rock gardening is usually a pretty safe affair if you do it right. But if there's certain things that you ignore, then you can get in trouble. I will also talk about environment and wildlife. And last not least, about a couple features. And that was the original plan, putting everybody to sleep by talking about all these things for about 2.5 hours, and then getting to the exciting thing with the videos. But then when Steve and I did the test run yesterday, and it turned out all the videos play a little jerkily, I decided to put you to sleep with videos too, and spread those a little bit throughout the presentation. So what I will actually do is I will talk about a few of these things with slides and then go through the features one by one, keep coming back to a feature slide. And that way, if it jerks, there's different ways for you to go to sleep. And then last not least, I'll talk about a couple more resources, the equivalent of a further reading slide, things like that. So with the teaser, the intro video, I'm trying to get you hooked on rock gardening if you are not already. But what I will also do to maximize my upload bandwidth is I'm going to turn off my video, because that would be transmitted with the same speed, and I hope that the video upload speed is good enough to not make it super jerky. So here's a video that that's also on my YouTube channel of almost 3 years ago now, that Mike Kowalski initiated, going out the gates. We went rock gardening out the gates. And let me reduce the volume a little bit here so I don't need to scream too loud. Noodling in between rocks, getting myself hung up on rocks. That's one of my specialties. And trying to time the waves to get myself off the rocks, going into caves. And a lot of these features are what we're going to talk about today. And of course, blowholes. I love blowhole showers. That's one of my favorite features. And here, Akiko almost backs into blowhole. Here, James and I share a blowhole shower. And was in trouble backing into the flow, a smack wall, a vertical wall with deep water. And then here's a feature that I call deception rock, and we will learn why that is. We will also learn what's important about timing a slot like this, how to time that so you don't have to paddle uphill. And how to avoid running into the side of the feature here, or even get yourself completely sideways, and that could have gone bad. And by the way, whenever I publish a video, publicly post a video where somebody is shown in a situation that could be perceived as unfavorable out of their boat, or like here, Johnny running into the rock, I always get explicit permission to post that before publishing it. So if anybody is concerned getting filmed by me on a paddle or something like that, I would never show somebody out of their boat to ridicule them or something, but only if it's instructive, and always with explicit permission. So here's a pour over into a pool. And again, I get myself hung up on the rock. And we will learn a little bit how to avoid that. And here I have better timing. I'm riding the wave over this somewhat tricky approach, and I go right into the pool. And again, a Kiko here. And this is maneuvering in between rocks with steering strokes, bow rudder, sculling draw here to move the boat sideways. Akiko's doing a bow rudder. We're going to talk about going around rocks, around features like this rock pile, I call this feature roundabout. And also what not to do, like here, I get tumbled over that rock by the reflection of the wave in the cliff and end up with my head in the pebbles, and eventually end up swimming. And unfortunately, the camera, the battery gave out. So there's a lot of things in this video, a lot of different features, a lot of different skills that we're going to talk about in the further slides. But let's start with the gear. Let's start with boats. What does and doesn't work? Boats ideally should be made of plastic that is heavier than a composite boat, but it's so much tougher. If you want to get into rock gardening, you will touch rocks. And plastic boats are a lot more durable. Composite boats need a repair fairly quickly. They should be under about 16 feet long. The shorter they are, the more maneuverable they are. The longer they are, the more flexibility they give you. If a rock garden paddle, what's posted as a park and play paddle, derails into a beeline paddle, which happens to me every now and then, it should have a rear hatch and either bow flotation or two hatches. That is so when the cockpit floods, the boat doesn't go down. And float bags, for that same reason, are a good idea. I have float bags in all my boats in the hatches, and the Karma that I have comes standard with float bags in the bow. Self-rescue should be possible. That's not the case for all the boats here. So for example, whitewater boats like this one are pretty tough to do a self-rescue on. If the boats are shorter and taller, it's usually tougher to do a self-rescue like a cowboy, cowgirl, or things like that. And river boats, whitewater boats, you should leave those to the pros. I'll go over a couple of boats that are common here. The P&H Delphin comes in 2 sizes, 150, 155, is pretty popular. Also the Valid Gemini SP. The P&H Virgo seems to be everybody's new darling and must be a pretty good boat with a similar skill set to the Gemini SP and the Dagger Stratus that I mentioned. I have myself. I have the 14.5L, and it also comes in a shorter size now, which I have not paddled. The Karma RG is among the shorter boats, a pretty popular rock garden boat for the bigger person. And the Piranha Fusion comes in 3 sizes, small, medium, and large, and is also pretty popular among rock gardeners. The big difference between these two is the Karma surfs pretty well, and apparently that's quite a bit trickier in the Fusion. Let's go to how you can modify your boats. One of the important things is attaching a string to the skeg so that you can get it out when it gets jammed with pebbles. And in rock gardening, rather than a string, using a zip tie is a lot more durable in my experience. I have straps, webbing straps on bow and stern of all my boats. That makes it easier to rescue a swimmer because they have something to hold on to, particularly if, as here with the Karma, the handles are all the way up, which when you're in the water is really hard to reach. Having knots in those straps, some people are concerned that you might get hung up in rock crevices or something. I don't think that's a big issue, but again, don't buy stock based on my advice. If you're concerned about that, don't put knots in the straps. Makes it easier for the swimmer to hold on to. One thing that I think is very important are something to protect your paddle, your spare paddle. That's paddle bridges in this case, or paddle scabbards. Some people have paddle scabbards on their boats. That protects the ferrule of the spare paddle, which is the furthest out. It's the most vulnerable part of the paddle. But if you're upside down on a rock, that's exactly what's going to smash against the rock. And last thing on this slide, the toggles. Here in this case for the Jackson Karma, it comes with these metal handles. And that makes it pretty hard to carry the boat any distance. So I put a toggle on here. And what's important is always make that a single line setup so you can't pinch your finger. Actually, not the last, but the second to last thing. The last thing here that I modified was perimeter lines. The stock perimeter lines end here at these fittings, and I extended them all the way around. And also put tubing around it that makes it a little easier to hold on to the perimeter lines. And the options obviously are endless. You can continue modifying, and I'm happy to discuss the modifications on my boats. I'm one of those people who mod pretty much everything. Are there any questions about boats? If anybody has a particular question, now would be a good time. And if not, let's go. Let's move on to gear. There's a certain level of overlap between rock garden gear and gear for other paddle applications, obviously. So I'm talking about those that I carry. Helmet is a great camera mount, but of course the main purpose of a helmet is to protect what's in your head. Gloves, you want gloves that give you both grip, particularly when wet, and protection. And the wet grip gloves, I meant to put a link in here, so we'll probably put a link in the video description then. For the wet grip gloves that I have, a wetsuit is more pierce resistance than a dry suit, but very many people do rock garden in a dry suit. Barnacles and mussels, that's something we're going to learn in one of my videos, are pretty sharp. A whitewater paddle makes sense if you want to get serious in rock garden paddling because it's shorter, it's sturdier, and oftentimes it's a one-piece design. And that means it doesn't have a ferrule, a connection that is a potential weak spot. And I always paddle with elbow protectors, and some people have suggested knee protectors, but I don't think anybody paddles with knee protectors because that would affect your fit in the boat. So depending on how much you want to go all in. And one thing that people may or may not consider is a hydration pack. In addition to giving you hydration, it also gives you more back protection. So one of the things, are there any questions to gear? One of the things that's important with rock gardening, you don't want to go all in at the very beginning. You want to start small with what I call precision maneuvering, or it's also referred to as noodling. And a very good place to do that is, as shown here, in Monterey.
The idea in essence is I try maneuvering my boat in between rocks that in the clear water here I can see rather clearly. And the conditions are very small. This is less than a foot of swell, occasionally 1.5 footers coming through. What's important here is even with that small swell, you still need to time the waves if you go sideways to the wave. And then let the wave help you through. Here you see a little slot between two rocks that I would not fit if I timed it in the trough of a wave. So I need to time the peak, need the wave to help me through this. And you can also see that I use a lot of steering strokes, obviously. And a lot of them are high angle strokes with the blade very close to the boat, because I only have so much space there. I need to carefully place the boat, and this is a really useful exercise for boat control. Again, you watch for a while what the water does when it goes through a feature, and always have your eyes to the outside, seeing what's coming in. And then once you think it's good, you push through, which is what I'm doing here. And in this case I have to push myself off the rock. That's generally something you want to avoid. Ideally, you don't want to touch rocks with your hands, particularly in bigger conditions. You have a very good and sturdy tool in your hand that lets you push off. Here's another scene, the similar principle, where we see a long period swell, a lot of water moving left to right, and that carries you very nicely through those rocks here, through gaps in the rocks. And here you can see how I make use of the wave pushing me right, and then the backwash pulling me back out over these rocks that in the trough of the wave would be submerged. And the swell amplitude again is very low, but occasionally we have a small wave coming through. Here I'm warning Russ, who's behind me, and we'll talk about outside and the meaning what that is in the clap, on the clap slide. And here another thing that long period swell, 15 seconds or more, enables you to do. You can time passages through gaps that are sideways to the wave direction by setting up in front of them. And I think that's what I'm doing here with the next passage. I'm timing the wave, I look outside, see where the wave comes, and I point my boat in the direction I want to go, and then wait for the wave to wash me into that position so I can go through. And here, Kathleen on her first paddle out the gate. Out the gate, there's also a number of really beginner-friendly features if the conditions are small enough, like they were on this day and in this recording. And again, the goal is maneuvering the boat through rocks, timing it with the wave, getting a feel for the rhythm of the ocean, for the waves that are helping you through or would push you against rocks if you mistime it. And again, I'm using the waves to help me through or in part over those rocks. Here's another thing, paddling close to the cliffs when the water is deep enough, or sometimes even when you have a little ledge, like what I'm paddling over here, in small enough conditions, trying to maneuver the boat close to the cliff here. So let me talk about a number of paddle strokes that are useful for rocks. One is a high angle forward stroke. You saw that in the previous video. A lot of times you don't have a lot of space, but it's also a more efficient stroke that you can easily turn into a power stroke. And it's not as wide as a low angle stroke. So if you don't have a lot of space in a slot in a narrow tunnel, you keep the blade close to the boat. A bow rudder or bow draw helps you make tight turns. And often it's combined with an inside edge in rock gardening, not the outside edge that the classical bow rudder stroke would be associated with. A cross bow rudder, I rarely use it in rock gardening, and I rarely see anybody else using it. The cross bow rudder lets you make an even tighter turn than the bow rudder, but it's less stable. So it reduces stability, particularly the perceived stability. Another really important stroke is the hanging draw, moving the boat in a diagonal line, moving forward while moving it sideways without changing the orientation, changing the pointing of the boat. And oftentimes it's just a very short stroke in rock gardening. Another important one is the J stroke. That's a stroke that actually comes from canoeing, where you paddle on one side only. Again, that's if you have limited space in narrow slots or tunnels. And also the sculling draw is important to move the boat sideways. I prefer that over the draw stroke. So let's start with our listing of the features. There's so much more features. There are so many more features than just pour-overs, and the ones I'm listing here are just a collection. Let's start with solitary rocks. The idea here is to time this well to go either inside or outside a rock. And I like starting a paddle. Oftentimes I start that with rounding a rock close to a beach, using the wave to get washed up on the beach. Here we see Kathleen rounding a rock close to a cliff in this case, also very small conditions on that day. Here Karen is using the wave, nice timing, riding the wave up behind that rock, and then using the backwash to get washed out. Here's a feature I like calling the roundabout. Kathleen's going around that one. And that's a feature that's only accessible in small enough conditions. Big conditions with low tide don't make it a good feature. Here James Jacobs and I go around that feature, and I take the turn a little too tightly, bounce off that rock and almost into him. But yeah, we have a lot of fun obviously, and that's what paddling is about. Here's another solitary rock, which is not really a solitary rock, it's a ridge. This is outside Point Diablo, and I've had a lot of fun with this particular feature. In this case, I'm not getting over the rock, and it takes me 3 attempts actually to get over here, because there's a substantial current oftentimes when there's a strong tide, both ebb and flood, and also the waves create quite a bit of current over this ridge that looks like a small rock when the tide is higher. This is a relatively low tide where the whole thing is exposed. Here's the example I mentioned earlier, riding a wave up on the beach and then using the backwash to come back out of the beach. And here actually I've almost run into Tom, so I probably should have given him a little more time, a little more space to clear the feature before I went into it. The next feature I want to present are slots. And slots can be as simple as going in between 2 rocks, all the way to long passages that you have to either paddle through or take a wave through. And again, it's a lot about timing. Here's a feature that I like calling Deception Rock, and that's because at high tide you only see what looks like a an innocent rock about 10 feet off the cliff. And yeah, if you mistime it, like I did here, you can get capsized. And in this case, I got hung up. My stern must have gotten hung up on the rock, so I can't roll on one side. I remember realizing that I can't reach the surface, so I switched to the other side. Here's the opposite example, just paddling through two rocks, or in this case, a rock and the cliff, and timing it sideways to the waves, timing it so that the waves don't push you into either the rock, the backwash, or the cliff. Here's a very narrow slot on the central coast with a turn in it, and I have to push myself off the rock quite a bit. And again, you see those high angle strokes, the J stroke here, that I use to maneuver my boat and speed up the boat to get through that slot. This is the opposite direction. And again, here the tight turn to get around the corner and back through that arch, which we're going to have in a later video, in a later recording. Here is, again, Central Coast near Shell Beach, an example of how you can surf through a slot. The wave carries me through that slot, and I don't have to do anything, don't have to paddle through the slot. And here, slot Goat Rock. And oftentimes these slots, depending on how they're oriented to the wave, what happens is the wave wraps around, and then all of a sudden you have a wave in oncoming traffic, and I still don't understand how I managed to stay upright in this situation. That was the deepest brace I've ever done. Another popular slot here by the Golden Gate North Tower. And Matthias is demonstrating a hanging draw here that he uses to make sure the boat stays clear of the concrete foundation.
This is Kathleen going in between two rocks, and apparently she gets hung up a little from the backwash, and then comes the next wave and pushes her up that rock a little. And she's clearly enjoying herself. This is Ryan Crocier on Deception Rock, and what you see here is he starts paddling when the water's completely out. And that's really how you want to time this feature. You want to start paddling when it's completely empty, and that's when the wave helps you through. Sometimes you have cross currents, and if you don't anticipate them, then you better hope your combat roll works. Here I'm going through Deception Rock, and I'm showing what we saw in the introductory video. The wave tends to push you left, and if you don't counter that, then either you need to brace like I did here, or you fall off the cliff. And here's another example of a slot and how to get through them. If you time it right, the wave helps you, and you can surf a pretty small wave in this case, actually, through that slot. And here, this is in Mendo, north of Van Dam. Same thing, I'm surfing a wave through the slot. And only in the very end, I'm encountering the wraparound wave that works against me. Okay, any questions to these two, to the solitary rocks, to the slots? Good, then let's move on and talk about CLAP a little bit. Somebody give me a hand. A lot of you know CLAP, know the acronym CLAP, what that means. The C in CLAP stands for communication. Those are the important things, not just for paddling, for all sorts of outdoor activities. And communication in paddling can either be paddle or hand signals. And that's important. That's why we talk about, in safety talks, we talk about those paddle or hand signals almost every time. In rock gardening, one important means of communication is yelling outside. And what that means is really pay attention. A wave is coming, or for whatever other reason, look outside. It doesn't mean, oh my God, the world's falling apart, but it means pay attention outside. And the response to outside is outside. for two reasons. A, you want to let the person who you talk to know that you heard it. And B, there might be somebody further inside, closer to the rock, to the shore, who's also interested in, hey, there's something coming in. Another important aspect of communication, if you go through the rocks in a group, and then you go because you assume that it's calm enough, you go around a boulder, inside a boulder or something like that, you briefly split off the group. Always make sure somebody knows where you are. So you may hear me say, hey, I'm going inside this rock or something like that if the rest of the group goes this way or that. I always make sure at least one person in the pod knows where I am. A VHF radio, as in all sorts of paddling, is also important, and it better be working. One of mine, I have 3 radios with different modes of malfunction. Just sent one in for repair the other day. The L stands for line of sight. You want to have line of sight to the paddler ahead of you or in the exit of the feature if you're still sitting in the approach. Once you've gone through the feature, you want to take a look at the paddler behind or sitting in the approach or the lineup. And you always want to be aware, is there somebody behind me? Going through a slot, going around a rock, going around a boulder. Is there somebody behind me who we need to wait for? Is everybody accounted for? And oftentimes also what that means in order to maintain a line of sight is you need to assume triangle positions. So back to features, next set of videos, blowholes. Nothing beats a salt shower. I'm a big fan of blowholes. And this is relatively short, just a collection of blowholes. Here's one in Mendo. I think that was an elk, if I'm not mistaken. Here is Kathleen on her first paddle out the gate. Blowholes sometimes come in tunnels. And a blowhole generally is a cave with a relatively small opening. And they all depend on the tide level and also reduce the volume here a little. And also on the swell, obviously, because you need air blowing out of that cave. And this is the blowhole just outside the north tower of the Golden Gate Bridge. Never seen it go off like this. So this was the ideal combination of tide level and swell. Somewhat bigger, relatively short period swell. And what blowholes always do is when you sit there for a while and they don't blow, once you turn away and decide to leave, that's when they go off again like it did here. Blowholes also do one thing. They sit in rock walls, and rock walls reflect waves, obviously. And sometimes, like here, I have a blowhole behind me that's in Russian Gulch in Mendo. And not only do I get the shower, but I also get a wave, and that capsizes me in this case. So that's also something to be aware of. They often come with waves that sometimes you can surf, but they sometimes might capsize you. Here's a blowhole between Muir Beach and Rodeo Beach. And that's Jim Carlson not sticking his nose into this blowhole. Probably wouldn't have been a good idea in these conditions, to be close to rocks in these conditions. And this is outside, just south of Rodeo Beach. I'm getting a salt shower. This is from the outside view, and this is Xavier getting his share, and he's evidently enjoying it a lot. The next feature is pools, and we have 2 kinds of pools that I want to talk about today. One is rock pools and the other one is tide pools. Starting with the rock pools. Rock pool is a feature usually up halfway up the cliff. You want to paddle into a rock pool.
Exactly, nice.
And anticipate how to get out. So you want to initiate a turn as you get up already, like Kathleen does here, and then ride the next backwash back out. And again, let me reduce the volume here a little bit. Did that earlier, but apparently it wasn't.
Good job.
Right, again, things for you. Here, Russ lets the wave
And turn.
push him in, but forgets to turn. That's why I remind him. A long boat is sometimes a little tricky to turn in those rock pools. And again, he waits for the next wave and then rides the wave out. And the next one to run that is Andy Walters.
Good job.
And what Andy does is he initiates the turn very early here, and then it takes him 1, 2, 3, all of 4 paddle strokes to turn his long boat around and paddle back out. His timing is so perfect, he almost makes it look boring. And then my timing is not quite as good. What you also see is here I start paddling when the water is the lowest, when the water is almost completely out of this feature. I initiate my turn rather early, I anticipate my turn, and then I ride the next backwash out and down. And of course you want to try stuff like that with higher swells. And here's a pool just inside Point Diablo. This is my nemesis. I've been beaten up in this pool. I've been capsized, and we'll see. I think that's in this video also how I get pulled back out. This is a very interesting pool. Best thing you can do is stick your nose to the left, where I just tried sticking mine, and then let the wave swing your stern around and over that rock that sits there like I'm doing here. So you can paddle back out forward. And what has also happened in this situation, right here, the next wave came in and pushed me backwards right back into that pool, which is not so good. And what's happening here, this is a different day. I'm late, I'm way late on the wave. And I get pulled back out. And this is not a roll really. I'm bracing into the rock, pushing myself back up on the paddle. So the paddle hits the rock and I cheat in a way and come out upright that way. So these are rock pools, but then the next one is a tide pool video. And this is a totally different way of, well, it's a rock pool in a sense as well. This is north of Van Dam in Mendocino. And this feature is known as the waterfall, and you need a really high tide to be able to go past the waterfall in a very narrow slot. And then we ended up in a tide pool with.
Wow, look at all the sea urchins. Oh my gosh.
They're really bad for the kelp, but it was so fascinating to see all those sea urchins in this pool, which is their crib in essence, or nursery in a way. Here again, you see a hanging draw, very high angle strokes that I use here because it's tight. I need my paddle, my blade close to the boat. And those are the same sea urchins. I went first, then Poseidon is stepping out of the water. And we had lunch there that day.
It was a small one.
With Russ standing out there. Kathleen filmed the sea urchins. And this is actually looking out. So the tide pool in this frame would be to the left. And these are the waves outside. And there are a few smaller channels that feed the tide pool with the water running out. At one point, our boats decided taking off, so we got back in our boats and ran that channel down with the waterfall. And again, notice the high angle strokes. Easier with a shorter paddle, shorter than Kathleen's touring paddle here. And I'm trying to time it so that I have a wave carrying me over the ledge. Yep. And it works reasonably well. Okay. Any questions to the tide pools? And
Hey, Jana, I have a question actually.
yep, go ahead.
Yeah. So it looks really fun, and I've been out with you and it has been fun. Do I need to feel bad about rock gardening at all? Is it bad for just all the intertidal life and mussels and all that? What's your take on that?
That's a very important question, and I actually have a slide on that.
Good.
So if you don't mind, let's park that question and I'll deal with that. In general, of course, you are absolutely right. We are getting into the habitat of a lot of animals, and there are things that are a lot more vulnerable than others. And that's a general thing in paddling, not just in rock gardening. And it's one of the last slides, and if you don't mind, we can also revisit that during the Q&A.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
So let's go back to our clap. The A stands for avoidance, or a lot of times it's also interpreted as awareness. Things we want to avoid are narrows, that is narrow slots when the conditions are big. We want to avoid boomers. A boomer is a submerged rock, and what happens is when the water gets shallow enough, it will break. The waves will break over the boomer, and you can actually sit on top of a boomer and then the wave breaks on you. And that's a really bad situation to be in. We also want to avoid shallows, that is shallow water close to either rocks or rock walls to cliffs. And that's also an important thing that I'm going to talk about in the risks section, because I used to be pretty good at lack of awareness, and along with that, lack of avoidance, and I've been beaten up pretty bad in the shallows. And of course, there are a couple other things that people should also avoid. And the other important thing you want to avoid is adverse conditions. If the weather is bad, if the wind is too high, or the swell is too big, or a long period high amplitude swell is in the forecast, then you might better want to stay at home. Last one is the P. P stands for positioning. And I'm interpreting this specifically with respect to rock gardening here. You want to be in the place of maximal usefulness, but also you want to avoid being in the way. What that means, you want to be off to the side. If you're in the exit of a feature, you want to be off to the side. You don't want to sit in the center, and you want to point to the paddler and the feature. You don't want to be sideways in the exit of a feature. Some people have a real talent to position themselves across the exit of a feature, and when you run the feature, that leaves you no choice but running into them. And also, if you see somebody who looks like a Teletubby with a GoPro on their helmet, there's a good chance that that person is filming and sitting in the exit of a feature for a reason. And do you really need to be right in front of them so you have the better view and they have you in the frame rather than the person who runs the feature? So those are more out of consideration, not so much to avoid a risk. Well, the sitting sideways is a risk, of course, but the frame, that's more out of consideration. Be aware where your position is maximally useful, so you can do a rescue if necessary, but not in somebody's way, particularly somebody who's running a feature and is coming there with a lot of momentum and maybe can't avoid you. So, next set of features: caves, arches, and tunnels. The definition varies depending on who you talk to. To me, cave is a tunnel if it has multiple entrances as opposed to a single entrance. And between an arch and a tunnel, I decide by the length, but name them whatever you like. Some people talk about tunnel caves, and for some people, arches don't exist. There's no consistent definition for these features, but they are a lot of fun. And here what we see is Kathleen going through a tunnel. This is north of Russian Gulch in Mendocino. And again, look at the high angle strokes that she needs in order to get to this narrow tunnel, fortunately with a high ceiling. And at the end, she sees the light, and again, a very useful stroke in rock gardening. I have to show off a little. And here, this is south of Van Dam in Mendocino, a tunnel with a somewhat limited clearance. And I'm timing it so a wave pushes me through, and I still can't really believe that my camera did not hit the rock in this situation. Watching the video, I just kept thinking, okay, but there is no impact on the case, and there was no noise. And then Kathleen also runs this, and let me fast forward a little bit where she comes out. Hold on. Here, at one point, she pushes herself off the ceiling and then ducks a little bit because the next wave flushes her out of the tunnel.
You good?
And that's a little odd feeling and can actually be a real risk in low clearance situations. With high swell, you want to be careful with caves and tunnels because you can get pushed to the ceiling, and then best thing you can do is an emergency capsize to make sure your boat gets pushed against the ceiling rather than your head. Here's a tunnel with a window on the central coast again. This is north of Montaña d'Oro. And I'm going through this tunnel, and then an arch that's off to the side here on the left. And this looks like if I stood straight up, I might not be able to get through here. Again, I'm trying to time the wave so it pushes me through, and I don't have to paddle where it's narrow. And getting out, I do have to paddle. Note the hanging draw and the J stroke that I use to keep my boat off the cliff to the right. And here, this is on the same paddle, a little further north. Russ is going through that arch, and I see a wave building, but I also see Russ has cleared the arch, so I don't need to warn him, but I don't want to go through while that wave is building, but want to watch what it does. And this is an important aspect as well. I always have, which makes the image a little hard to watch, but I always have my eyes outside. I always look what's coming in outside. And that's something that takes quite a while to learn to predict what's going to come in. It's really something that you need to learn by doing. It just takes practice. Here's a tunnel with, at Point Lobos. And this is technically a slot in the beginning. I just wanted to show that because of the white sand here. Almost looks like the Caribbean a little. And that's very unusual. You don't see that very often in rock gardening. And then comes the tunnel. And one more time, what I'm showing here is strokes on one side, in this case on the right. And when I have enough space, I do two-sided. And here I'm retaining my momentum with the J stroke, with that stroke that comes from canoeing. That helps me maintain momentum. It's not a very good stroke to gain momentum, to get the boat moving, but in order to maintain it, if you only have enough space to paddle on one side, that's very useful. Also from one of my more recent YouTube videos, this was on Independence Day or the Independence Day weekend. Dinosaur caves on the central coast near San Luis Obispo. Shell Beach. And here I'm paddling out through that same cave. Enjoying the echo, and well, it's a really wide,
Look at this.
really big cave.
Yo.
And sometimes you have the light playing through caves like this. This is just gorgeous. The blue. And then Kathleen is paddling out here. So really marvelous, gorgeous features in many places. And this is, we call that Stonehenge of the Sea. This is north of Montaña d'Oro. This was this fall. And the combination of arches, tunnels, slots. So Kathleen is following me here into this narrow passage. Where you really need to place your strokes carefully. And I don't think you can go there if the conditions are much bigger than what we had that day. So this was unusually calm conditions. And here Kathleen shows a very nice J stroke, the canoe stroke that lets her paddle only on one side. Here she shows how to hold position when the waves come in so she doesn't get pushed backwards into the rocks or up that cliff. Rather than just sitting there passively, she's always active, countering the backwash here by back paddling, then paddling forward to get over the wave. And we're paddling out through that slot on the left. Try to time it so that there isn't a set coming through at the time. And there's a rock in the middle here that she needs to avoid. And does it. And here you see why it's called Stonehenge of the Sea. It's a collection of rock stacks that are connected by arches and things like that. Okay, any questions to this so far?
Bingham, did you have a question? Did you raise your hand?
Yes, I wanted to know if you go out and scope out these areas from the land side before you get in there with your kayak.
Usually no. A lot of the local features are, well, we just know them. Usually when you go somewhere for the first time, you go with somebody who's familiar with the area, who can show you the features. And if in doubt, it's certainly not a bad idea to scout a feature or scout an area, or rely on somebody with local knowledge. So in the case of the Stonehenge of the Sea, for example, John Bonaventure, who's a local and very familiar with the area, showed us around. And then also with experience, you also learn to judge a feature and whether you should go somewhere or rather stay out of there with a reasonable level of reliability.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And again, just a reminder, if you do have a question, feel free to unmute and break in because we
Exactly.
can't necessarily see you waving your hand as too many people at once. Thanks.
Yeah. Jan, this is Paul. I also,
Huh?
in my experience, realized that features are really variable depending on the conditions, and sometimes, you're not. It doesn't look so familiar if it's a bigger swell or conditions are a little different. So
That's correct. Yes. That's a very good point you're making here. Knowing a feature in one set of conditions doesn't mean you really know it. They vary in all sorts of conditions. And in some of the videos, you may have seen features that I show more than once. And for example, Deception Rock will be shown in a variety of conditions here, very calm conditions. And some of you have paddled it yourselves. And then in bigger conditions, it's completely unmanageable, things like that. But that's a very good point, Paul. Thanks. Okay, so the next feature, rock walls. Rock walls are useful to learn boat control, to learn holding your positions, and you can also take an elevator ride if the water is deep enough. So we're going to show that here. We start with the very basic, that is in essence just get close to a rock wall and try pointing your bow at the same point all the time. This is to become, well, comfortable being close to rocks. Being close to rocks does not need to mean it's something bad. Just paddling close to a rock. Try getting as close to the rock wall as you dare. As long as the water is deep, and again, that knowing that either means you're familiar with the area or somebody who is lets you know. If the water is deep, you can be really close to rock fairly safely, like I am here. This is outside Point Diablo. Another exercise worth doing is what I do here in Monterey. And of course, we have that annoying droplet, according to Murphy's Law, right where it's most in the way. What I'm trying to do here is pointing my bow to within a foot or one section on this rock and compensating for the waves. So that's why, even though the video quality with the droplet is bad, I think it's valuable. That's a really good exercise that you can do for a workout in relatively calm conditions. And being able to hold your position both sideways and forward backward is also something that's important when you set up for a feature, when you set up for like a pour over or something like that. And here is what's called the elevator ride. This is in Goat Rock. Greg Berman and I think that's Ellen Shaw to my left and Evan Bergeson. We are at the Goat Rock, the rock outside the parking lot, in somewhat bigger conditions. And again, we have our bow within inches of the rock, and that's because we know it's deep water there. So for the most part, it only goes up and down. And as long as you make sure your bow doesn't get caught under some overhang or something like that, it's a really safe thing to do. Though somewhat scary. It is intimidating to be close to a rock like this when you do it for the first time. And as I said, make sure it's really deep water. We will learn a little later why that is important because, well, I have misjudged that a number of times. And then it's not such a good idea to be there. Okay, and I think we can, this should be close to the, yep, this is close to the end of that video anyway. Okay, any questions to that? Good, then let's go to the do's and don'ts, or rather the things to look for in rock gardening specifically, and things to avoid. We want to look for an approach to a feature without obstacles. That means we want to have relatively calm water. We don't want to be sitting on rocks all the time. We don't want to have to go around rocks or around turns or corners to get to a feature, to a slot or a pour over, which we will look at later. Also important is an exit, particularly from a pour over into deep and calmer water. And that also provides a calm place to do a rescue. That's also something important. You always want to keep in mind, okay, if something goes south here, where can I do a rescue? And you don't want to do that with the waves smacking rocks that are in front of a cliff or something like that. And ideally, you want a feature, particularly a slot or a pour over, you want that oriented with the wave in the direction of the wave, not sideways to a wave, at least initially. The sideways thing is also something worth practicing, but initially try finding something with an orientation that so that the wave can help you. What you want to avoid is feature where there's no escape path, where you end up in shallow water, so you get pushed against a rock or a cliff. You also want to avoid having to go uphill, as I call it, which means against the wave or against current through a narrow slot, because in a narrow slot, it's hard to paddle hard. And it's easy to get pushed sideways into the walls. And yeah, as I mentioned, an orientation sideways to the wave also, at least initially, is something you want to avoid. And you want to avoid obstacles and turns in the approach to a feature. And you want to avoid boomers. Again, what are boomers? Boomers are rocks that are submerged, but the waves break on them, break over them, and you can see them when you learn reading the water. You can see if a wave breaks out of the blue, that's a boomer. And that's where you don't want to be. If you see it breaking, that means the wave can break on you when you paddle over it. And I've seen more than one capsize, and I have myself capsized more than once thanks to a boomer. And the list, of course, is by no means complete. Okay, how about timing? We talked a lot about timing a feature, and that goes for not just pour overs, but also for slots. You want to set up close to the feature, and that means you need to learn holding your position in a wave. That's the last video that I showed, the rock wall, right? Learn holding your position by actively paddling. You want to look outside, and again, I talked about that a little earlier. You want to look outside and try to predict what's coming, and that really requires practice. What I like calling match and catch. In order to run a feature, you want to match the wave speed and then catch the wave, so the wave helps you and you don't have to paddle through it, muscle through it. And then you want to ride the back of the wave. And what's also important, a lot of videos, you may have heard me go paddle, paddle, paddle. And that's really paddle like you mean it. You don't want to be backwashed through the feature. If you miss the wave and the next backwash pulls you back out. It's also because steering is a lot easier when you have momentum through the water. If you don't move relative to the water, it's in essence like moving your boat from the standstill, and that requires more power than moving through the water. And on pour overs, it's also important to keep the bow high. In whitewater paddling, they call that a boof, because the bottom of the boat boof hits the water. And it also helps avoid the stern thump. That's if you feel like, okay, well, the wave is carrying me over the pour over, and you stop paddling, and then your stern drops on a rock that's in the exit of a pour over. So a general rule that I wish somebody had told me earlier or early on during my own rock gardening is never stop paddling in a feature. And if you go paddle with me, you will keep hearing me yell, paddle, paddle, paddle. Don't stop paddling. And also in terms of timing, time the day you go out. A small, long period swell makes life so much easier. You've seen that with the noodling video that I showed early on. A long period swell can help you through features, help you behind rocks, around rocks, and timing is nowhere near as crucial as with a short period swell. Because, well, in a long period swell, if you have a feature that you can run, say 1/3 of the wave cycle, 1/3 of 15 seconds is 5 seconds, right? If you have a short period swell, you only have 9 seconds swell, say, a third of that is 3 seconds. So you have 2 more seconds to go and catch the wave. Any questions to that? The do's and don'ts and...
Jan, there is a question. Eric, just unmute, and you can just unmute and ask your question.
I'm completely unfamiliar with, I know what swell is, but just as a rule of thumb, what counts as a small swell and what is a long period?
Okay, so swell periods that we encounter around here range from, I think the shortest we usually have is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 seconds. And the longest, 20 seconds, is a really long period swell. And I would count anything in the neighborhood of 15 as long period swell. And small, that would be a foot 2 feet at the most. But then also it depends a little bit on where you are and what the direction is, because that then determines how the swell wraps around rocks. So for example, if you have a northwesterly swell and you go out the gate, then what you see is only what wraps around Point Bonita. And that means you can have a much larger amplitude and you will still see relatively little wrapping around Point Bonita, and then even less will wrap around Point Diablo. Whereas if you have a southwesterly swell, I would not want to be out there in a 4 feet at 15 seconds. You probably don't want to be close to rocks in those conditions.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, so let's go to the pour overs. That's another video that's very interesting, and we start small. We start here with Russ showing us a relatively small pour over. That's how we start. And then we get to Disney, where Bill Vonnegut shows us how to survive a large drop. And I think he tried spinning his paddle before running this and then decided, nah, I'd rather need both hands on the paddle.
Like now.
And
And then
yeah,
the
let's
next one
work our
carries you over. Keep
way
paddling, keep paddling. Don't
from
stop
small.
paddling.
And again, I need to
Nice.
reduce the volume here a little. Here's Kathleen on her first paddle out the gate again. Joe Berkowitz, the same paddle. Very small conditions, running the pour over by Kirby Cove. And these could be your first pour overs. This is how you can practice timing.
Next wave coming. Nice.
Sometimes you may need 2 waves to get over the pour over. This, for example, would be a 1.5 foot amplitude. And I think that was, I forget what the period was, probably 12, 13 seconds or something like that.
Woo. Here comes your ride.
And then, yeah, once you learn that, you can move on to go to Goat Rock. And Kathleen shows how to run this one. And next thing you know, you do double pour overs on the Central Coast, or triples.
Nice.
And yeah, this multi-lane pour over, we had a lot of fun with that pour over. We also had a couple capsizes, but I'm not going to show those. That's in a video again on my YouTube channel.
Go.
Here's Kathleen
Go.
showing a pour over that's sideways to the wave, and that's exactly why she's running there. She's running into the rock. That was last year, so she's learned a lot in terms of predicting the waves. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking behind me to see the wave is coming, so I can compensate for it. I'm pointing more to the right, and that makes me go straight, smooth through. This is Disney again, showing that you can survive pretty big drops, or you don't. And then you're surprised by, oh, I managed that roll, good. And everybody's still here. Here's showing how pointing towards the paddler can make the day, because Susan and I can pass each other. I'm filming, then we can pass by just raising our paddle. Had I been sitting sideways, she would have run into me. And here's not a single pour over, a single gap in the rock, but a whole wide ridge. This, I think, is in Elk, Mendocino, but I'm not 100% sure. Somewhere Mendocino. Same principle. And here, Ryan Cocchier shows running a similar feature, a collection of rocks just outside the Golden Gate. And the next scene, I do the same thing. And I get a lot of wave reflection off the cliff to the left. So that's always something to be prepared for and be aware of. Where is the wave reflection? And here, oops, Kathleen shows
Flip your boat upright.
Everybody's disappointed.
Go to
Shows
your
what
bow.
happens if you don't brace,
Go to my
fall
bow.
out of your
Transfer
out
to
of your
my
boat,
bow.
but nothing much happens.
Yep,
Even
put
though we
that
have a
on that
short
bow already.
misunderstanding, I tell her to go to her bow, but then I already have her boat, and tell her to go to my bow.
Okay, I'm gonna
Even though we
Go
have
to
that
my
short
boat.
misunderstanding, we practiced our rescues together. And it takes up here is a timer. I started at the moment she flipped.
keep your butt low.
And it takes her less than a minute, substantially less than a minute to be back in her boat. So nothing much happened. If you want to rock garden, yes, you will be upside down, and yes, you will swim. We are all in between swims, so be prepared for that. Be sure to practice your rescues. Okay, questions to pour overs? Then let's move on. The last in the series of features here, not rocks at all. What happens if you are not in Mendo, if you are not at the Central Coast, and the conditions don't suggest you go out the gate? Well, you can paddle around wharves and piers and practice your boat control. Berkeley Pier is notorious for being pretty good for that. Or buildings on the water, the Skates restaurant by the Berkeley Pier or the Monterey waterfront, or even submerged trees like in Lake Sonoma. And that's what I'm going to show in the last video. Oh, hold on. Disclaimer, man-made objects can be particularly hazardous because oftentimes, unlike nature-made rocks, they may contain substantial quantities of metal, as in rebar or some other stuff. And we'll see that in one of the clips that I'm going to show here. So the man-made features. Here is Monterey Aquarium. I'm doing a sculling draw to diagonally move my boat with the bow being parallel and in the same distance to the rock wall, to the concrete wall here. And the Monterey waterfront is ideal to do this type of noodling in between pilings. This is Albany bulb. And here you can see, if you look closely, there's a lot of scrap metal in those rocks, and I don't think I would go there in conditions any bigger than this. Here's a gear. Rebar would probably pierce a composite boat and might actually even penetrate a plastic boat. Another feature that you can use to practice boat control, and this is not a rock garden boat at all, are markers. In this case, oyster bed markers in Tomales Bay. And here I'm just practicing a bow rudder, steering strokes. The same boat control that you use in rock gardening, that's also useful in a longer boat. And the downside of a bow rudder when you have a helmet camera is that there's a good chance that you have your hand in front. And here is on Lake Sonoma, I think that was 2 years ago, when Steve Goldfinger and I noodled through dead trees in Lake Sonoma. The trees are not man-made, but the lake is man-made. That's why I put that in here. And it's the same principle here. It's practicing boat control, trying to get through in between those dead trees, those tree stumps, tight turns, seeing where do I fit, where don't I fit, timing it so that here, for example, Steve is out of the feature by the time I push through in between the trees. It's the same skill set, even though that has nothing to do with rock gardening, but it's the same skill set that you need in rock gardening. Doing a tight turn, pulling your bow around here, getting through that narrow gap here between that tree trunk and the branch. And I think that's mostly it here. And I forget what comes next in this video.
I just want to add that there was one of our favorite features here was a Y-shaped branch sticking out of the water that your boat could not fit through. But if you went in it at a pretty good speed, it would flex, stop your boat, and then send you pretty nicely backwards, which was really great fun.
Yeah, that's a good point, Steve. And for whatever reason, I decided not to keep that in the video here. That scene was also from a video that's on my YouTube channel. It's like something with Lake Sonoma. And there you can see both Steve and myself running into those Y-shaped branches. That was a lot of fun. I could have gone on noodling through those trees forever. And here is the Skates restaurant at Berkeley Pier. And I think I'm gonna cut that a little short. You get the idea. The nice thing about this is there is no hidden metal or anything on the concrete pilings on the Skates restaurant. There's a lot of barnacles, obviously, but nothing that you can seriously injure yourself on. And here is north of that, the rock art on the Berkeley Pier. Okay. Any questions to this, man-made features?
I just want to add another really fun place to play with is if you're paddling Carquinez Strait and going, say, from Martinez over to the Eckley Pier, there are rows and rows with hundreds of old pier pilings still sticking up out of the water. They're rather scratchy, so you definitely want a plastic boat if you're going to go play in them, but they're really a lot of fun. And sometimes you have pretty good current going through, which makes it even more interesting.
Are you promoting my YouTube videos? That's one of my most recent YouTube videos from a paddle that Dave Breakbill, who I saw on the call earlier, initiated, where we also ended up going through those pilings. That's a lot of fun, but also a good opportunity to scratch up your boat. Good point. Thanks, Steve. Okay, let's talk about wildlife and the environment. That's what Beth had a question about earlier, and I'm getting to the end, so we could leave that for the discussion. Most frequently, we're gonna encounter pinnipeds. That's flipper feet, if you translate it, and the most frequent ones are harbor seals. What's important here is keep your distance, obey the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Don't look at them, that's something that spooks them. Don't talk or yell, "Hey, there's seals over there!" That's actually also what flushes them off. Why is it so important not to flush seals off their haul out? They conserve body heat by hauling out, and every time you flush them off, they lose a lot of body heat or energy to get back up on that feature. And also, particularly during pupping season, you may also spook them away. Sea lions and elephant seals, we occasionally see them, but not so frequently in rock gardening typically. Similar for sea or river otters. Around here, we mostly have river otters. The northernmost sea otters, if I'm not mistaken, are Elkhorn Slough. There's resident river otters. There's a pod in Tomales Bay and at least one pod in Drake's Estero that I'm aware of. So most of the time what we're going to see here is river otters. They will stay out of your way, but don't approach them. What's important about birds? The most vulnerable birds are cormorants. They get spooked pretty easily. Apparently less so when you pass inside, because most of the time they're facing out. And the reason they sit like this is because they don't have oil glands, so their feathers are not water resistant, so they need to dry themselves. That's why they sit like this, and each time you spook them off, and oftentimes they hit the water when they fly off, and boom, they're wet again. What I don't understand is why so many countries have eagles in their insignia, and invariably the eagles are pictured in this position, which eagles rarely do, but cormorants do. Another vulnerable bird is the common murre. It's particularly vulnerable when they're nesting. So the nesting season's coming up, and that's actually one of the reasons the rocks, Bird Rock, south of Rodeo Beach, has now been closed for boating, because that's where they are. So if you see these guys, particularly on rocks, keep your distance. And in general, in spring during the nesting season, watch out for rocks, for birds on the rocks, as well as for harbor seals. They're not always easy to see. Other birds are less critical. Brown pelicans are usually cool when they sit on rocks above us. And most other birds fly around anyway. Oyster catchers are pretty common when you go rock garden. That's the black guys with the red bill that squeal and run after the oysters. They're trying to catch them because they run away so fast. And most other small birds also don't suffer much if you spook them off. And then there's the rock dwellers, and I guess that's what Beth's question mostly pointed at. It's the mussels and barnacles. So we want to try and minimize damage by impact with the boat by running on the rock. And also we want to leave behind as little microplastic as possible, but unfortunately it's somewhat inevitable. The good news about damage by impact is that real estate substrate is at a price in marine life. So any mussel that we knock off, well, there's a happy taker. That's the oyster catcher here, or seagulls. And also there's a lot of happy takers for that space. So that empty space will be refilled very quickly. But in general, yes, it's a very good idea to be aware of the environment and minimize the impact, collect trash and things like that. Okay, any questions to that? Then let's talk about the risks. And that's the last set of videos that I have here. Things often go south when basic rules are not observed. And basic rules are, well, the timing. Both the timing over the feature, but also the timing of, should I have gone out at all, or should I have done a different paddle or ridden my bike instead? It often goes bad if you're too close to shore. If there's a cliff or the seafloor is closer to the surface than you think, and that's actually my first video that we're going to look at. I was in shallower water than I was aware of. If you sit above a boomer, because oftentimes next thing you know, you sit on the boomer and the next wave breaks on top of you and tries washing you off. And that usually doesn't go too well. Also, if your protective gear is in the hatch or in the trunk, which I have done twice. Once, we're going to see that in the video with not so great effects. The other time, fortunately, it was without consequences. And also if conditions deteriorate during the paddle. You start out in sunny weather with small swell, and then you didn't look at the forecast and you got 10-foot, 20-second swell coming in, and all of a sudden you go, holy cow. And last not least, mixed swell can cause sleeper wave. Mixed swell is when two or more swell components come together and they can stack up, and all of a sudden, and we're also going to see that in one of the videos that I'm going to show, all of a sudden you got a house break-in on you. Unexpected, much larger than the ones that you had before or after. And it all boils down to, as I mentioned, lack of awareness. That's usually when things happen. So let's take a look at that. And I'll start again with something that's on my YouTube channel. And what's happening here is I'm in shallower water than I'm aware. Now I know that this string of rocks in essence means there's shallow water underneath, and that wave washes me in quite a bit more than I want. This is in Monterey. And then the next wave was a little bigger in real life. With a GoPro on your helmet, it always looks a little smaller, and I panic. I get washed in, I realize I'm getting washed in, and for whatever reason, I think it's a good idea to eject rather than at least trying to roll up. What's the worst thing that can happen, right? You paddle, your blade hits the rock, so you can still bail out. And then, yeah, the boat's trying to hit me, and I end up getting washed back and forth on the rocks for a total of 8 minutes. I had the camera running the entire time. We're not going to go through the entire time, just a few highlights. One of them is at one point, I think that's the next thing that's coming. I'm telling the people on the cliffs, this is the Monterey waterfront, right next to walkways and things like that. There's a lot of people up on the cliffs, and they're trying to help me.
I'm okay.
So I tell them, hey, I'm okay. I'm not injured or anything. I'm not incapacitated. If you endanger yourself by climbing down here when you can't really do much more than I can, and at least I'm already wet, then rather stay safe, stay out there. So eventually, after about 8 minutes, my boat decided to take off, probably a riptide or something like that. And the pod outside, they towed it to Lover's Point. And eventually, I managed to stand up, climb out. And lick my wounds. And I want to show this because I was idiotic enough to have my wetsuit pants and also my rock garden gloves in the hatch. I didn't put it on because the conditions seemed too big to get close to rocks. So I had them in the hatch, but didn't have them on. So fortunately, it didn't hurt as bad as it looks. Don't be that idiot. I made the mistake so you don't have to. Similar situation here. We are in shallower water than I am aware. This is between Rodeo Beach and Point Bonita. And I'm yelling outside to James. And then James says outside, way outside. And even though that's not an official term, I understand what he means. Turn around and see that house breaking on me. And we try getting out of there as quickly as we can. Again, there's a string of rocks going out to sea. And this is something that Mike talked about 2 weeks ago. This is an indication, hey, there's shallow water. And the waves in this area build up much higher than just north and south. And in the previous scene, we were roughly there.
Yeah.
Had we been there in this situation, that would have been very bad. So similar thing here, Deception Rock. We talked about that before. Good timing, setting up close, starting paddling when it's completely empty. I get through nicely. Next time I try, I'm too late, or I set up too far out, actually. I'm also starting paddling when it's completely empty, but I'm too far out. End up paddling uphill, and I'm not good at that. So the water coming over the ridge ends up capsizing me. And in this case, I ended up swimming. And here's Gwen Bizarre. The same paddle, actually. And I think he was the next one to run, and he does the exact same thing. So I was back in my boat. He was the next one to run after that. And he also comes out upside down, except his roll is better. So he just rolls up and goes on with his life. But then not too much later, he cracked his helmet in there. Here, same situation. I'm too far, I set up too far out. I'm too late on the wave. I end up going uphill before I go downhill. And I'm not really happy about that at all, except this time I'm lucky and the next wave is a bit more benign and just flushes me out.
Ooh.
Different situation here. I'm in relatively shallow water with rocks, and the wave pushes me against the rock. So I'm tripping backwards over a rock. We got the same thing in slow motion here. And I wouldn't be in bigger conditions. This is relatively small conditions. In bigger conditions, I would be nowhere near this close to the cliff. And here, that was in essence just tough luck, bad timing. And I'm doing a cartwheel, literally. And what's really interesting, I remember all the stuff that went through my head when I was upside down there, between that and rolling up. And in reality, it was like a 2-second thing until I was back upright. And I'm not sure, I think that's one more thing. This is a cove between Point Diablo and Black Sand Beach. And can't hear that in the beginning of the video, I'm saying something like, I'm not comfortable with the amount of air that's in this water. And that means there was a lot of energy dissipated. So I'm going into that cove that I've paddled through a number of times, but the backwash pins me against that rock. And the next wave tumbles me over. I absolutely expected to hit my head against the rock. Apparently I hit the camera because it was pointing up, but no impact on the head. So I was incredibly lucky in that situation too. So this just as a couple examples of what happens when you don't observe things like, hey, put your protective gear on. It only helps on your body, not in your head or in your car. Okay. I'm wrapping up here. I'm already a little over time. A few more things, two more slides or so. Initiating a rock garden paddle. So if you are at the stage where you want to initiate a rock garden paddle, if not, co-initiate it with somebody who can, be sure to call either a coastal paddle or a park and play rock garden paddle and be clear about it. Because in a park and play paddle, you want to have a small number of participants, usually fewer than 8, or you want to split up in multiple pods. And all this is not taking COVID into account necessarily, where you want to have smaller number of participants anyway. Because otherwise, people end up waiting in a park and play paddle. They just end up waiting, getting cold, getting bored, getting frustrated. You don't want people to come in composite boats for reasons I talked to earlier in the presentation. And you also want to try and time it so that the return doesn't turn into a beeline paddle where you have to go back in a straight line because it's getting dark or people have commitments or things like that. And that's not necessarily fun in short boats. If you call a coastal paddle, the pod size doesn't matter that much. The tides may play a whole different role from the park and play paddle. But you don't want people to show in short boats. There's only a few people who are happy paddling their Fusion or their Karma RG in a straight line from Point Diablo to Point Bonita. For most people, it's not too much fun. Okay, a couple resources, as in further reading. My YouTube channel, Shoreline Flyer. The name originates from my other hobby, flying stunt kites, but I haven't done that in a long time. Also worth watching is the Neptune's Rangers YouTube channel. They do wilder stuff than I have shown here. There's a number of classes and instructors that you can take where you can learn both the basics. Not all of the strokes or skills I showed may be familiar for everybody here. And there's also a few who specifically do rock gardening. I saw Laura Zolliger on the call earlier. I know she does it. Not sure whether Mike Kowalski and Jennifer Yearley do that right now. So there's a number of classes where you can learn rock gardening skills. The skills clinic is coming up, not specifically for rock gardening, but more for the basics. We specifically don't do rock gardening, but we do a coastal paddle. And then, of course, there's the annual Mendo Madness, where there's a lot of opportunity to do rock gardening. I would like to thank a number of people for either providing media or advice or discussion. A lot of the videos you may have seen is from Kathleen. Mike contributed the photo. Ellen helped me discussing the wildlife, the information there. I learned a lot from Bill Vonnegut, Ryan provided a couple videos, and here are most of the people starring in the videos I showed, but I'm pretty sure I forgot somebody. So if somebody recognized themselves and I don't mention them here, sorry about that. Okay, I want to finish with one last video that's also on my YouTube channel that again recaps a lot of what I showed you, and that's, well, it helps with retention. Adults learn by repetition. Let me say that again. Adults learn by repetition. And now all together, adults learn by repetition. So let's repeat a couple of the things that I talked about in last video. This is from rock gardening in Goat Rock. Here's the elevator ride on the actual rock, going up and down close to the rock, doing kind of a pour over, well, pretty far out from the rock, and then I do something that I told people not to do, be in somebody else's way. Well, this somebody else gets caught by an unexpectedly large wave. Damon and I have a history of near misses, almost collisions. And then he runs over a rock cluster here, pour over of sorts. And this is Brian. By the way, the people who are in the YouTube videos that have credits are not on the thank you slide. Here is Kathleen running that slot that I had that very deep brace in because I mistimed it. Here's Stuart, a nice, very short hanging draw to keep the boat straight. James Jacobs running the same feature here. And they all time it much better than I did it in that video that I showed pretty early on. And here I'm running a pour over. This is a nice example of how a wave can, if you get the timing right, which I occasionally do, how a wave can help you. See how it pushes me forward. Okay. This is the same pour over that we've seen a couple times before. And yes, you can survive a pretty steep drop. And here Randall shows how to do an endo. And this is how not to do it. Brad demonstrates how what happens if you stop paddling while you're in the feature. And Randall does the same, but he survives. This is how to reshape the bow of your boat by running a slot and running into the sidewalls of the slot. And this is Brian timing it very nicely. And here's another one of those long pour overs, and see how I don't stop paddling. I just keep paddling. I keep paddling all the way until I'm all the way through, always active. That lets me control my boat and prevents me from all of a sudden going sideways and backwards. Even though my shorter boat, the Karma would spin a lot more easily. And then, yeah, Damon does the pragmatic thing of backing out. And here, this is the tall tunnel by Goat Rock, close to the gauntlet. And this is deep water. This is you can get a really nice elevator ride in this this tall tunnel. Okay, that's it. I'll open the whole thing for questions. Turn my camera back on. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jan. I actually have one question. You didn't talk much about something that always worries me, which is what happens if you get stuck in a feature? You're inside, you can't get back out, you're kind of trapped in a slot, other people coming in to rescue you, you have to get yourself out, or is this a topic for another whole webinar?
That possibly is a topic for rock gardening for the advanced paddlers. I haven't seen that happening very often, quite honestly, literally getting stuck and not being able to get out. I have swum in situations where, well, I had to push the boat out and then swim out. And I have rescued people from those situations. Yeah, I think that will be a more advanced topic, because that requires a lot more than would have fit in the scope of this webinar. But in really getting stuck in a feature where you can't get out, or where you get trapped underwater, that is something that fortunately happens very infrequently. There's one event in Deep Trouble, or More Deep Trouble, one of the two books, an incident that happened, I think it was north of Muir Beach, where somebody got trapped in a slot. But it's rare that things go this far south in the somewhat moderate rock gardening that I do. I mean, I paddle nowhere near the level of Neptune's ranges, and it's entirely possible that it happens more often with them, but I haven't seen it happen often.
Jan, I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
Have you ever started running a feature and then changed your mind in the middle of it? And what did you do about it?
Are you talking about now or earlier?
Well, both.
Yeah, both, exactly. That's what I was going to say, that it depends. So one of the most important things that I did not mention, and thanks a lot for that question, once you got started, you are committed pretty much. You don't really want to stop paddling in most situations, because what that means is you end up being sucked back out by the backwash, or you have to go backwards through features that you do not really want to go through. So most of the time nowadays, for me, what it means is, if I change my mind halfway through, I still go. But that took a good while, and I have been in much bigger trouble usually by changing my mind, stopping paddling, or even back paddling when I was in the middle of a feature. And the turnaround point is something you develop a feel for. Okay, this is the point where I can still go back, and here is my V1 in essence, in aeronautics, my point of no return, where I have to go, because stopping and taking my momentum out would cause more trouble than going through and facing whatever's coming there. Did that answer your question?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gail. Further questions?
John, I have one, sorry.
Uh-huh.
Because of the changing tides, I imagine the difficulty, there's no like rating as there would be for running rapids in rivers, say.
That's correct.
So is it more just a get there and see kind of thing? Or do you have a sense of some areas that are better for beginners or intermediates or more advanced people?
There's no formal rating. That's a very good point, because the conditions change so much, not only with the tides, but unlike whitewater, the current changes direction every 5 to 20 seconds, right? So all of a sudden, what could pin you for a little while is completely harmless a couple seconds later. What's almost impassable at a high tide, because you have too little clearance, is easy peasy with a low tide and small enough conditions, things like that. In general, areas that are beginner friendly, Goat Rock tends to be very beginner friendly when the conditions are small enough. There are a lot of features that allow you to noodle, what I showed in one of the first videos. A lot of smaller pour overs and tunnels, really interesting tunnels. It's a gorgeous environment. It's a pretty long drive for East Bay and particularly South Bay dwellers. Going out the gate, if the conditions are right, is also a pretty beginner safe exercise. But as we discussed at some point through, it's always a good idea to at least initially go with somebody who's familiar with the area, somebody who, well, could have warned me of, hey, here's shallow water, right? If you get washed back here, you're too close to rocks. You don't want to be there. And it's always better to learn that from somebody who knows the area than learn it by trial and error. But sometimes trial and error is also something. And in general, if the conditions are small enough, pretty much everything is beginner friendly. Not bloody beginner as in you should know a rescue, a T-rescue. Ideally, you should have a self-rescue. And if you want to be in slightly bigger conditions, there's a certain skill set. But a lot of things, yeah, almost everybody can do. The noodling thing, like Monterey. Launching at Monterey Bay kayaks and then paddling out to Lovers Point. If the conditions are small, that's peachy.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question.
So Jan, we're up almost at 2 hours, and
Yep.
it's a testament to how entertaining and informative your webinar is that everybody has stayed, or so many people have stayed. You only recently had attrition. But fantastic, visual, perfect, really fun. And I appreciate everybody coming, and thank you so much for serving as our instructor and sharing your expertise and your sense of humor.